The disappearance of the highway patrolman near Ash Fork. A winter front moved across the high mesas west of Williams when a patrol unit stopped near Ash Fork on the interstate shoulder. The first call to county dispatch described a parked cruiser with lights flicking in windblown grit and no visible officer nearby. The officer was David Keller, 39, highway patrolman, assigned to traffic enforcement along the corridor between Seligman and Williams that week. He left the substation after a routine briefing about black ice formations reported by truckers along shaded cuts east of town. His stated purpose, according to state records, was to monitor a construction taper set along a narrow bridge approach near mile marker 264. The cruiser camera showed lane markers bending through frost and snow feathers moving like powder from the plow ridges. The microphone captured only windrush and an ignition idle that shifted pitch as the alternator compensated for light bar draw. Maria Ortega, 47, long-haul driver, was hauling insulated produce toward Kingman after picking up palletized freight in Flagstaff near dawn. Her log noted a slowdown near the Ash Fork interchange and a trooper unit angled behind a stranded sedan with hazard lights. She reportedly saw a figure in a dark jacket walk from the cruiser toward the guardrail where the shoulder turned to brush. Her statement, filed that night, added that drifting spindrift obscured the figure almost immediately after the door shut. She did not stop because a second unit was expected based on advisory messages that reached her cab radio. Dispatch logs for that afternoon reference Keller advising a plate check on an older sedan with temporary tags that did not match the make. The recorded time, taken from console entries, put the event near 9:15 as the snow intensified around Low Scrub Hills. A reply from records confirmed a mismatch that required a further stop review under procedure regarding possible fraudulent registration display. Traffic camera frames captured the sedan signal across the taper before easing into the shoulder where cones began. The sedan position remained consistent across several frames until a burst of powder erased details beyond the guardrail. Archived notes from the local maintenance yard describe a temporary drop in visibility near the bridge over Partridge Creek during mid-morning. A crew foreman wrote that crosswinds from the north pushed powder through the taper and rattled plastic drums against the barrier ends. Those notes mentioned a lone cruiser parked short of the bridge nose, with the driver door open wider than expected in such wind. The yard memo carried no conclusion about the patrol activity, only an instruction to reposition drums once visibility returned. The author of the memo later said he believed the trooper waved him through while attending to the sedan driver. State records list Keller as a 9-year veteran with prior wildfire support experience and winter operations training completed during 2 recent seasons. He qualified on roadside risk protocols that included 3-point positioning of flares, with an emphasis on avoiding smoke recoil near fuel vapors. Training outlines suggest he would be unlikely to leave his engine running without attention for longer than a few minutes during a live stop. The cruiser computer recorded multiple authentication pings, which indicates the engine remained on while the unit computer stayed awake. Investigators never confirmed whether door sensors captured an accurate timeline, since the harness connector had intermittent faults noted earlier that month. A ranch hand named Luke Porter, 32, seasonal worker, crossed the frontage road to check drifting across his gate while winds pushed snow into shallow dunes. He later told deputies that the sedan driver leaned on the guardrail and smoked while the trooper spoke on the radio. Porter described the driver as medium height with a bright scarf, though he admitted distance, snow glare, and wind made everything seem grainy. Some locals claimed the scarf detail belonged to a different sighting on a different day, and records conflict on the time. Porter insisted the memory fixed around the sound of a freight horn rolling across the draws east of town. At midday, the construction taper crew returned from a salt run and found the sedan door ajar against the rail, scuffed by spindrift. The car interior held a coffee cup, a glove, and a folded paper map soaked at the creases by driven snow. County deputies found the keys under the driver's seat and a registration stub that matched a plate number different from the displayed tag. The county file from 2009 includes a guidance form about counterfeit temporary tags that investigators cited during the first briefing. They towed the sedan to the yard while a search team worked the brush south of the bridge where cattails lay crushed in wind lanes. The cruiser remained on the shoulder with the light bar switching through patterns as the battery bus dipped under alternating loads. A second unit arrived and found the radio on local repeat and the shotgun still locked in its bracket under the console. The driver's seat carried Keller's jacket, and his hat rested brim down on the passenger floor as if placed there to avoid wind. Boot prints led from the driver door toward the rail and then along the barrier toward the creek bed cut by winter flow. The prints doubled back once, then broke apart where powder filled the depressions and obscured direction near chaparral that clung to the slope. Searchers followed the creek line downstream toward the junction where ice forms brittle shelves shaded by basalt outcrops. They flagged scuffs that might be boot scrapes against rock ledges and found a small light clipped to a vest strap under a snow lip. The light belonged to Keller based on an engraved initial, though the battery showed charge and the clicker worked without failure. A glove liner lay 7 strides away, and a plastic evidence ruler set in photographs showed a consistent tread shape in compressed powder. The pattern matched the department-issue boot ranked for winter operations, which gave confidence for a concentrated sweep along the left bank. During the afternoon, Maria Ortega delivered her trailer to a Kingman yard and returned to speak with investigators about the scarf and the smoking driver. She said the driver stood still, as if bracing against wind while keeping the cigarette cupped, a habit she recognized from mountain passes. Her recollection placed Keller between the driver and the cruiser, with his shoulder radio lifted toward his face near the guardrail posts. Investigators never confirmed a radio transmission during that precise moment because a repeater outage occurred when power fluctuations hit the tower. That outage appears in utility reports and in dispatch logs that reference brief static bursts followed by dead air and reset signals. A wildlife officer named Eli Warren, 58, retired wildfire crew and seasonal ranger, joined the search along the creek meanders after volunteers formed grids. He knew runoff channels around Ash Fork from years of mapping nesting sites before spring and recognized several sink pockets that collect powder after wind events. Warren found a patch where snow seemed scooped in an oval and pressed by a heavy form sliding downslope from the rail. He marked the spot and radioed, then followed a short skid toward brush where a torn cuff rested under a juniper limb. The cuff stitching matched Keller's uniform issue based on a later lab note included with photographs and chain of custody forms. Archive notes from a prior winter mention a similar drift pocket that formed under a jumping wind at that same bend near the bridge turn. A plow foreman described how cars could appear to settle into a whiteout while only yards away from bare gravel strips. The note advised units to overrun the cone line and stop farther past the bridge nose to avoid the funneling gusts through the guardrail posts. Keller's vehicle position, marked in spray paint after the tow, sat just within the funnel sector described by the maintenance memo. Whether he knew the risk is unknown, though his training files include a section on wind eddies around barrier terminations. State records show several calls from travelers reporting a figure walking the median hours after the initial stop near Ash Fork. One call suggested the figure carried a bright cloth that whipped in the wind and then vanished behind a salt truck spray. Another caller described a uniformed person moving along the barrier and then crouching between drums as a semi passed with slush boost. Investigators ran those reports against lane camera frames, but could not align the timestamps with known truck movements recorded by the waystation. The mismatch left a gap that investigators noted without drawing conclusions, because records conflict across sources and clocks drifted during the outage. Late light washed the draws as a helicopter searched with a thermal unit that read the landscape in pale washes of heat and shadow. The camera picked up coyotes moving single file and a herd of pronghorns scattered across a fence gap south of the interstate. No human heat bloom appeared along the creek banks where teams marked probable flow paths between junipers and basalt shelves. At dusk, the teams withdrew as temperature fell and a clear sky promised a hard freeze over the drift pockets. A deputy stayed with the cruiser as a tow prepared for removal, and a tarp covered the windshield to protect interior prints. The sedan owner, contacted through registration files, lived in Mohave County and reported the plates stolen during summer before the snow season. He said he sold the car 2 weeks earlier to a buyer who paid cash and took the vehicle without a name entered on the title. The description given by the seller did not match the figure Maria recalled near the guardrail smoking through the wind. Investigators never confirmed whether the buyer and the driver were the same person because the transaction lacked a recorded bill of sale. A later inquiry noted small drill marks near the plate bracket that suggested a quick swap performed without care for alignment. Some locals claimed a patrolman once warned about a narrow step near the rail where the fill slumped during heavy thaw years ago. The county road book included an entry about that settle with a recommendation for riprap that budget delays postponed beyond another season. Snow filled the depression in layers as wind drove crystals against the rail and then into the low along the slope. A person stepping from the shoulder could slide, lose balance, and strike brush before arresting on a shelf near the creek bend. Searchers tested that route and found scraped bark, small threads of uniform cloth, and granular ice chips stuck to the fabric. The last confirmed radio position for Keller triangulated near the bridge nose using signal strength from 2 towers before the repeater outage rolled through. A technician later explained that strength readings mislead during ground refraction under cold inversions over the mesas. The estimate still set him within a short walk of the cruiser at the time Maria saw the jacketed figure by the guardrail. That alignment supports the view that he had not walked far before. Snow and wind obscured his path across the drift pocket. Whether he pursued the driver on foot or stepped away to inspect the sedan underside remained unsettled after weeks of review. The county file from 2009 contains a checklist for cold weather searches that the sheriff cited when expanding the grid into the draws. The list emphasizes boot impressions in powder and the capture of small textile fragments where brush scrapes occur along narrow paths. Teams returned over several days and documented scattered impressions that led nowhere once sun crusted the surface and wind reset the field. A scarf fragment appeared near a cattail stand and matched no clothing from Keller's locker or department inventory logged at the substation. Some locals claimed it proved the driver moved along the creek line, though investigators never confirmed a full scarf from the fragment alone. In the following week, the snow receded along south faces, while shaded pockets kept their stiff crusts under cedar boughs. Maintenance crews removed the taper and set a warning board about drifting near the rail gap by the bridge nose. The patrol cruiser remained off-duty as lab teams worked the interior and finally returned it to the yard behind a chain-link fence. State records note that Keller's radio keyed several times after the outage cleared, though no voice transmissions followed those key events. Technicians attributed the signals to automated resets and not to manual use, a conclusion recorded after firmware inspections at the communications shop. Several archived notes, reference calls from hikers along a section of old roadbed west of Ash Fork where cinders surface in thin patches. They reported finding a badge clip near a juniper, though the badge itself was absent and the clip showed corrosion from prior seasons. Investigators marked the find as uncertain due to lack of provenance and possible placement by wind or by animal movement across camp detritus. That entry sits beside a note about a lunch receipt found in brush near the bridge, a receipt that matched Keller's purchase from a Williams diner. The receipt time falls within the morning window and supports his presence on the route earlier than the stop near the taper. Months later, runoff deepened the creek and exposed stones where snow once stacked and preserved shallow marks along the slope. A volunteer team found a radio cord near a root snag, its plug scuffed and the insulation cut by a sharp edge. The department radio in Keller's cruiser still carried its cord, which made the creek find a likely unrelated item from unknown origin. Some locals claimed it showed parts shed in a struggle. Yet investigators never confirmed a second radio issued to Keller that winter. The find joined a small shelf of objects in the evidence room with tags that read uncertain and deferred pending future comparison tests. Records conflict on the final sighting time because different calls reached the sheriff line and the highway line as power returned in uneven blocks. A tourist bus reported a figure in reflective trousers east of the interchange, walking against traffic with an arm raised toward a plow. Another traveler said a uniformed man stood behind drums and waved a flashlight below waist level near the bridge nose. Neither sighting aligned with camera frames due to snow sheets over the lenses and abrupt exposure shifts when trucks passed. The investigative summary notes that conflicting timelines, complicated verification, and left sequence uncertainties that never closed despite successive interviews. The official notice lists David Keller as missing while off the shoulder of the interstate near Ash Fork during a winter weather event. The notice states he exited his vehicle during a stop involving a sedan with mismatched registration and did not return to the cruiser. It also states that search operations covered the creek line, the brush slopes, and the construction taper area with negative results beyond clothing fragments. The write-up includes references to dispatch logs, to state records, to archived notes, and to the county file. From 2009, the final line records that investigators never confirmed a route of travel or conclusive contact with any identified driver from the sedan. The bridge approaches now carry riprap under the rail where the settle once formed a shallow step hidden by wind and snow powder. A small marker for a generic safety reminder sits near the shoulder where the view opens toward distant hills and a thin band of pines. Drivers pass with steady speed, and the wind still pulls through the guardrail posts and rattles the plastic drums when storms cross the mesas. Some locals claimed a trooper lights the shoulder during those storms, and a flicker rides the spindrift before sliding into the draw. The remark appears in several informal statements, and investigators never confirmed any source beyond reflection and powder-crossing headlight beams. The stories. The quiet truth inside that coastal hospital wing. The hospital sat 2 blocks from the water, and the wing that faced the inlet stayed quiet through every busy shift. People joked about the sea air, then lowered their voices near that corridor like sound itself preferred to drift away there. On a mild spring morning, Leora Penn showed up with her coffee and a checklist, planning to finish safety checks before lunch. She was 34, and she worked as the environmental services supervisor, which meant she tracked odors, stains, leaks, and things nobody wanted to notice. She liked simple goals, like swapping cracked casters on linen bins before anyone tripped while rushing a patient. The storm last week flooded a basement stairwell, and today she wanted to log the final moisture readings and close the work order. Everything else could wait until the afternoon. Her plans changed before the first break. A nurse from the cardiac floor stopped her by the supply elevator and asked a question that landed with a small cold wait. "Did you move a bed out of 12 East overnight?" the nurse asked, because that room looked freshly mopped and nobody had the call light plugged in. Leora said no, then walked the nurse back to 12 East. The room held a made bed, smooth as a catalog photo, the kind of smooth that usually meant empty or staged. The call light cord curled like a quiet reminder, and the plug lay against clean tile. The monitor cart blinked in standby, which was normal if a discharge happened, which the board said had not. She pulled her phone and checked the overnight service log. The log showed a water alarm cleared at 3:12, plus a linen delivery at 3:28, and the standard generator test at 3:30. Nothing about a bed move. The floor techs had signed off at 4, which tracked with the rotation. She felt the wing hush in her ears as they stepped into the hall. The hush was not spooky, just oddly firm, like the sound of a theater after the speakers cut. She remembered 2 other techs mentioning the same hush months ago, which she had written down as acoustic weirdness from the renovation. The walls from the pre-1980 edition met the newer drywall at shallow angles, which could bend sound enough to make a whisper vanish. The nurse pointed down the corridor toward rooms 14 through 20, which were half full after the storm transfers. "You ever notice the alarms sound softer here?" she said, "even with doors open?" That question turned a small worry into a task. Leora thanked her, then called Raffi Soto from facilities, who was 41 and worked nights on chillers and pressure monitors. Raffi said he could meet her after he ran a test on the pharmacy air handlers. She told him 12 East first, and to bring his handheld sound meter. While she waited, she checked the housekeeping closet and found a single wet mop hung wrong side up, which bothered her more than it should. The rag bucket held 5 clean tags, which meant 1 tag missing. She counted cart liners, then photographed the tag numbers, then texted her team group, which answered with the usual thumbs and jokes. Raffi walked in with his meter and a grin, then lost the grin when he heard the haul. He held up the meter while a monitor alarm chirped in room 16. The reading was lower than upstairs by real points, not just a little. He tried the code blue test switch on the mock panel, and the hallway speaker tone sounded like a phone in another apartment. They stood there for a quiet minute that stretched. She felt the cool push of air on her ankles, like a vent trying too hard. Raffi crouched and checked the gap under door 18, then looked at a ceiling return. This wing was set for negative pressure during a flu surge, he said, and someone forgot to return the dampers. That could pull sound into the duct runs. They both knew sound should not disappear completely, and hospital speakers had their own lines, but the observation mattered. Leora asked if maintenance logs showed damper positions. Raffi said the old building used manual marks with paint dashes after a storm, and sometimes those faded. He called his lead, who checked archived notes from winter. The notes reportedly listed a temporary negative pressure setting for isolation overflow and a reminder to reset after discharge. The reminder had no follow-up check line, which could be simple human miss and not a cover for anything worse. Still, the room felt staged wrong. Leora walked back to 12 East, then took photos of the made bed from 3 angles, partly habit, partly evidence. She opened the closet and found a folded patient gown without a size sticker, which was nothing by itself. She checked the Sharps container seal, then stepped into the bathroom and looked at the floor drain for silt patterns. The ring looked clean in a way that suggested a recent rinse, not a final deep clean. She called central coverage and asked if a float nurse had swapped rooms overnight. The charge nurse checked dispatch logs for bed control and found a 1-minute call at 3:29 that dropped before anyone spoke, which felt like a butt dial or a cold finger hitting end. The caller ID showed the station handset in this wing. Leora went to the security office and asked for hallway footage. The officer on duty, a patient man named Colm Reyes, 37, pulled the clip from 3:15 to 4. They watched the split screens without commentary. At 3:17, a linen cart rolled in from the elevator without a staff badge visible. The cart moved slowly, with one wheel catching, which matched the caster she meant to swap today. At 3:19, the cart paused outside 12 East, then shifted, then kept moving toward the end of the hall. They watched for the badge reader hits that should flank every elevator entry on that floor. The system registered 1 badge at 3:14 from Raffi earlier, and 1 at 4 from a night nurse, and none for the cart. Colm explained that carts come up with drivers who badge at the service basement, then sometimes ride with a different staffer when floors swap loads. That could account for the missing badge, and also could not. They checked the service elevator camera and caught the same cart doors sliding open at 3:16. The elevator captured a slice of reflective plastic and the edge of a sleeve, no clear face, and the time overlay blinked because of the generator test. The overlay sync had drifted last week, which Colm was already fixing, which meant timestamps needed cross-checks against other clocks. Leora asked for a still from the moment the cart paused at 12 East. Colm printed a page with the grainy frame that showed the cart handle and a sliver of the room placard. She carried the print back to the wing and held it near the door under the light. The sliver matched the height of the placard, which confirmed little, but the angle of the cart showed the handle turned inward, which delivery staff rarely did when rolling past. She took out her moisture reader and checked the wall behind the bed. The numbers showed dry, which fit the recent mopping. She checked the strip beneath the bed casters and saw a thin gray smear that did not look like dust. She swabbed it with a clean wipe and noted a faint powdery drag on the cloth, not slippery like floor finish. She sent the wipe to Central Supply with a note asking for a basic powder test, which was really a habit from her last job at a larger facility. In that job, she once traced a peculiar residue back to construction dust tracked from a blocked stairwell, which explained an odd cough cluster that week. She had learned that small housekeeping notes sometimes solved problems everyone else framed as strange luck. By late morning, she had a sketch of the corridor on her clipboard with marks for return vents and speaker positions. Raffi walked the ceiling path and found a junction where two return lines met above room 15, which could create a pressure sink if one line pulled harder. He said he would check the damper blades for manual marks, then pulled down a tile and sighed at a rusted screw. "This wing is like a ship that forgot how to float," he said, which she appreciated. A nurse from 19, an older man named Keaton Ward, 49, stopped by and mentioned something from Winter. He said he heard a voice on the hall speaker one night that sounded like a whisper on a phone. Just one word that might have been wait. He filed the report with his supervisor and chalked it up to a bleed from the intercom test. He offered to show his written statement, which he kept in a folder because he kept everything. His statement matched the time when isolation overflow ended, which lined up with the damper story. Leora worked through lunch and built a timeline with the clearest markers. The service log showed an alarm at 3:12 and a linen event at 3:28. The call log showed a 1-minute station call at 3:29. The camera showed a cart at 3:19 by the hall feed with a possible overlay drift. The badge system had no hit at the elevator at 3:16, likely because of a basement badge only. None of that explained the made bed and the unplugged call light. She checked the oxygen cylinder rack in the utility room and counted 2 empties in the wrong slots. The exchange sheets said 4 full arrived yesterday afternoon, with 2 used overnight in rooms 17 and 20. That math should yield 2 full and instead showed 1, which could be a miscount or something more routine, like a cylinder staged for respiratory and not logged. She asked respiratory, who checked their sheet and said they had pulled 1 extra for a transfer that ended up canceled, and that the cylinder sat by a stairwell for 10 minutes while a therapist helped a patient. The therapist sent a note with the time, which was 3:25, which touched the period where things felt odd. By mid-afternoon, Central Supply texted back a photo of the wipe with a small note. The powder fluoresced under a standard light test in a way that fit with foot powder or a powdered latex glove residue, not construction dust. That pointed back toward a human routine, not a leak from upstairs. The note did not accuse a person, and it did not need to. She went back to 12 East and sat in a guest chair and listened. She heard the sea through glass and vents, a soft hush without rhythm. She leaned forward and spoke into the empty room, a simple line that felt like testing a bridge. "If anyone adjusted your alarms to keep the peace, I will put them back where they belong." Raffi returned with a small rag of paint, marked with faded red dashes. He had found the damper blades set to a position used during winter isolation, which explained part of the quiet. He reset the blades to neutral, then ran the test tone again. The hallway speaker sounded like a real alarm finally, and 2 nurses popped their heads out with startled faces, which reassured her and annoyed them. They still had to explain the made bed and the unplugged cord. She checked the discharge board again and found no new names, just a morning transfer to imaging. She pulled archived calls and found another brief call at 3:31 from the same station that ended without audio, which now looked like someone purging a stuck line. Column radioed that he found a maintenance note from Winter that instructed staff to purge stale intercom channels after negative pressure resets, which nobody had repeated since. They called the linen contractor and asked about the overnight driver swap pattern. The contractor said his drivers usually wheel carts onto the elevator and ride to the target floor, but during generator tests, they sometimes stop one floor early and let a staffer guide the cart to avoid stopping between floors. He checked his dispatch sheet and found a driver note that said elevator stopped short during test, staff pushed to 12, all good. He could not give a name, only the time block. By late afternoon, the picture sharpened enough to make sense without drama. A generator test overlapped with a linen delivery and a damper setting that muffled alarms. A staffer moved a delivery cart, paused by 12 East, noticed the mop bucket, pushed the cart aside, and quickly mopped a spill. The staffer made the bed to help, then forgot the call light plug during the rush. The unplugged cord did not match best practice, which would be fixed with a reminder, not a report that accused anyone. The part that still bothered her had to do with the oxygen cylinder timing and the extra pause by the stairwell. She asked Colm to pull stairwell footage if available, which he did, and showed a therapist propping the door while holding a cylinder with one arm and shepherding a patient with the other. The patient looked steady, which matched a canceled transport returning to bed. The moment accounted for the missing cylinder, which returned to the rack at 3:43. She closed her notebook and wrote an incident review in plain language. The review recommended returning dampers to neutral after surge events, verifying hallway speaker levels during generator tests, and making a fast rule about plugging call cords before remaking any bed. She added a line about how lavender air freshener should stay out of patient rooms because it could mask odors that indicate a problem. She always added that line, and sometimes it stuck. Before she left the wing, the nurse from earlier walked up with a small, tired smile. "So, not a haunting," she said. "Just a lot of people doing 3 jobs at once." Leora nodded and answered with the calm confidence of someone who had stared at too many messes that looked like mysteries. "It is pretty much always the simple chain," she said, "and sometimes the chain gets quiet enough that nobody notices the missing link." That evening, after the emails went out, she stood by the loading dock and watched the inlet. The tide came in without hurrying, and the gulls wrote slow lines across the air that nobody would ever read. The wing would sound normal tomorrow, which meant patients would hear every beep that mattered, and staff would hear every page that counted. The quiet truth had not been a ghost, or a cover, or a headline. It had been dampers, timing, human judgment, and a hallway that swallowed sound for a while. She locked the dock door and tucked her clipboard into her bag. She would never tell the story with flair, because the unsung fixes never loved applause. She would remember the hush, though, and the way it taught her to trust the boring explanations first, then test them anyway. In a building stacked with lives and wires, truth rarely shouted. It arrived like a tide in a coastal wing, steady and patient, and loud enough once you fixed the vents. The stories. Why this abandoned cabin had alleged proof in drywall. The story kept circling a single point about an empty cabin and a word written behind drywall. People called it proof. They did not agree on what it proved, but they repeated the word until it sounded heavy. Renata Vale was 36 and worked as a county property assessor who handled delinquent parcels. She drove a faded sedan, kept a folder of index cards, and listened to dispatch traffic. On a late spring morning, she headed to a decommissioned fishing road where a tax sale cabin sat empty. Her goal was simple and boring, which was to document storm damage before the auction and verify the interior. The cabin stood near a shallow creek with boards turned gray and a porch sag bent toward the dirt. A rusted mailbox leaned near the gate, with paint scabbed off and a number grit filmed over. Renata took photos for the file. Then she checked the back door where a hasp hung, but the lock was missing. She logged the broken hardware as prior damage, then stepped inside while the floor pressed its complaint. The incident began as a sound that did not fit the room, and then a sight. A sheet of drywall in the front room had a patch that sounded hollow when tapped. The panel was bright white against tobacco walls, and 4 black screws sat too straight and clean. She noted a faint dust halo around the joint compound, which looked newer than the rest by many years. She started a routine sweep while recording voice notes to keep the chain of events tidy. The stove held a nest of brittle twigs, the fridge was gone, and a thin mattress lay folded. Renata kept moving and counted outlets, then paused at the patched panel again. Her notes said the sheet brand looked like a type common after 2010, not the 1980s era expected here. 2 neighbors drifted by while she worked and gave versions that agreed on mood, not detail. A ranch hand named Cleo Vargas recalled sirens and smoke from 1998 when a fire line whipped through. Cleo said a man who stayed here left in a hurry and never came back, and people held a fundraiser that winter. A grocer named Benito Lake remembered men in a county truck replacing a little window about 2012, though he admitted the year could be off. Renata took their names, then asked if anyone else checked the cabin in recent years. Cleo said an insurance adjuster came by after a windstorm, and Cleo believed the woman filed a report and sealed the door. Benito said a teenager broke in 2 summers later. Then a deputy taped a notice and told kids to stay away. Renata wrote both recollections as witness statements with the usual caveats about memory. She returned to the panel and looked for a reason a patch would be that clean inside this neglected shell. The screws were square drive, which was common for newer fasteners, and the spacing suggested a single small repair. The joint compound had been sanded poorly and left a telltale crescent above the seam. She ran a small flashlight along the edge and found a hair-thin line that was not paint. Her job did not include prying open walls without cause, so she called her supervisor and explained the condition. He told her to capture more context and check permits, then hold off on any invasive step until the records search. Renata agreed and left the cabin to sit with her laptop in the car while the creek talked its small talk. The county database was a stubborn thing that offered results if you knew how to ask without being greedy. She entered the parcel number and found a series of tax liens followed by a default. The permit history showed 2 entries worth attention. First, a window replacement request filed 2011, then a drywall materials purchase noted by a grant program 2015. The second entry surprised her, since the grant was designed for weatherization, not interior repairs. She cross-checked the vendor list and saw a receipt from a hardware store 3 towns away. The purchase line item said half-sheet gypsum and screws, with a date in early summer 2015. A note mentioned a volunteer crew and a case number from the sheriff office. Renata paused and rechecked the address to make sure she was not mixing properties. She downloaded everything, then called the sheriff records clerk and asked if the case number could be viewed. The clerk said the report was open public information because it involved property maintenance hours completed after a welfare check. The description said a deputy supervised a group that boarded a back window and patched a hole where a wood stove pipe had been. The deputy name was listed as J. Kravitz, with a badge number and a contact line. Renata called the number and reached a retired deputy, who answered his phone with a dry voice and correct dates. He remembered standing in that cabin while a volunteer placed a sheet over a hole, and he remembered the neighbors bringing lemonade. He also remembered boys laughing because someone had drawn a cartoon in dust above the refrigerator space. Renata thanked him and asked if any record included interior photos from that day that could be released. Kravitz said he took 3, which he felt comfortable sharing if the clerk confirmed the release path. The email reached her 10 minutes later, with 3 small images showing a 2-clean patch, a bent stovepipe, and a blank wall. The timestamp read 2015, with an hour that matched late afternoon shadows. Renata zoomed in and saw the same screw pattern she had just seen in person. She returned inside with a copy of the email printed, which satisfied her need for a pre-image before touching anything. She recorded a video on her county phone, then gently ran a utility blade along the painted seam and loosened the small patch. The square drive screws turned with almost no resistance and dropped into her pocket. The board came free and showed the backside marked with pencil lines. There were 2 words in block print near the center, and a string of numbers that looked like miles or hours or both. The words read, "Tell Mara," then below them a date in words that matched late summer 2015. A thin arrow pointed toward the upper corner, where someone had tucked a sealed plastic bag with a micro SD card. Renata did not touch the bag, since she already had more than enough cause to stop and phone this in. She stepped back and spoke to her phone, as if it were a witness who needed comfort rather than patience. She said she had an evidentiary find, likely tied to a case report from 2015, and she described the board condition. She then called her supervisor and said she would hold position and request a deputy to document chain of custody. Her voice felt steady, which helped, and the creek still talked. The responding deputy arrived from the nearest substation and followed a familiar script at a deliberate pace. He photographed the panel, bagged the micro SD card, then requested a second unit to confirm signatures. He also asked Renata to repeat her steps for his body camera, which she did, and her voice stayed calm. He wrote "Tell Mara" in his notebook and underlined the date, then asked about any person by that name in the area. Cleo returned when he saw the cruiser and stood at the fence with a careful expression that suggested curiosity and worry. He said a woman named Mara used to work at the gas station near the highway, and she moved inland after the big fire. He believed she dated the man who once stayed at this cabin, whose name people rarely said anymore. Cleo said the man had a brother who fought with him over debt, which was rumor, and old rumor at that. Renata kept the witness statement straight and did not chase speculation, because theory makes friendly noise but muddies facts. The deputy asked dispatch to check archived calls around late summer 2015 for any mention of the station or the creek. Dispatch later replied that an incomplete emergency call pinged a tower near the old highway with a man's voice saying "wrong truck" before the line died. The call was never connected again, and the dispatch note listed a response that found nothing conclusive on the road. The investigators gathered all of this and began to lay a clean map of what the drywall might mean. The board was patched during a small volunteer day led by Deputy Kravitz, who remembered no note then because the drywall face was clean. The writing was on the backside, so whoever wrote "Tell Mara" likely wrote before installation or wrote during installation and then faced the board inward. The micro SD card fit the same logic, since it had to be tucked away before final screws. The sheriff tech opened the bag carefully and previewed the card on a laptop while Renata stood near the doorway. The card held a few small files and one audio clip that was less than a minute long, with a man breathing hard. A voice said, "Mara." Then there was a scrape sound. Then the voice said, "Wrong truck? Check mile marker 12. Then silence. The text said the file metadata matched a late summer date, 2015, which matched the pencil note. The deputy asked Benito about mile 12, and Benito said a vanished reflector stood near a turnout everyone used for tire chains. He said the place was not on maps, but everyone knew it by a crooked pine and a faded mile stencil. A second unit drove there and found an old-cut bank with broken bottles and a rusted number plate choked by vines. That team then called for a grid walk and a metal sweep, which turned up a torn piece of a license frame. County records later produced an abandoned truck report filed by a salvage yard in early fall 2015. The report said a pickup had been moved by a private tow from a turnout before a storm and later sold for parts. The tow ticket listed a different mile marker by mistake, likely copied wrong by the driver, and the ticket names were hard to read. The salvage manager admitted their clerk sometimes took shortcuts with paperwork when storms crowded the yard. A detective interviewed the retired tow driver and asked for his memory of the pickup and its condition after the call. The driver said he remembered an empty truck with a broken rear glass and a tarp inside that smelled like gasoline. He said 2 men met him at the turnout and pointed to a path, and he signed a work order that he no longer had. He said he remembered a gold wedding band on a chain near the shifter, which he placed in a cup holder out of caution. The audio clip and the drywall note nudged the case from rumor to a timeline that had context and checkable waypoints. The incomplete call in 2015 used the words "wrong truck," which matched the audio and echoed through dispatch records. The mild repair day in 2015 created a perfect stage for a message that only a future visitor might find. The instruction "Tell Mara" suggested the writer knew a specific person would eventually hear about the cabin again. Renata learned that temp crews sometimes used whatever board they had in the truck, which could explain the face-inward mistake. A volunteer might have grabbed a sheet with a pencil note from the stack without thinking, then installed it with the note hidden. Another possibility was that the writer meant to hide the message, assuming a person who cared would eventually come prying. Both options fit the facts, and neither required creative leaps that could not be defended in a report. A second pass through the micro SD card revealed a photo of a dashboard with a gas station logo seen through the windshield. The date stamp matched the summer of 2015, and the triangle logo was the old brand used before a sale. Benito confirmed that the station repainted their canopy that autumn, which inadvertently confirmed the window of time. The detail felt small and almost petty, yet it anchored the sequence to a real week. The detective contacted the station owner, who produced archived night logs showing a purchase by a prepaid card at 11:42. A print from the receipt showed a pack of ice and a cheap burner phone that matched the model seen in the photo. The clerk on duty had long since moved, though a manager remembered a man who returned twice that night to borrow tape. He said he thought the man looked scraped up and he remembered a truck with a blue fender and a white tailgate. A family member of the man who stayed at the cabin identified the voice on the audio as a high likelihood match. They provided an older voicemail that had similar breathing patterns when the man climbed hills for fun on weekends. The sheriff office sent both clips to a regional lab, which returned a cautious report that said the two voices were likely related. The lab kept the language safe, which made sense because certainty in audio work is often impossible. The drywall word itself caused arguments in corners where the story traveled faster than any memo could hope to move. People liked the part where the house was silent for years while a small message waited for a careful hand. Some said the word proof made sense because the voice was clearly him, and because the date matched the summer when he vanished. Others said proof is for courtrooms and journals, and this was only a lead until tested. Renata held her own view, which was that houses keep small time capsules without meaning to, and sometimes that matters. She had seen children's names carved into baseboards under carpet and grocery lists folded under a sink. She had also seen unsafe wiring stuffed into a cereal box and tucked inside a wall, and the box told its own story. People leave messages wherever they can, hoping someone decent will listen someday when it counts. The case shifted again when a trail crew found a piece of a phone shell near mile marker 11 during a separate survey. The shell matched the burner model bought that night, and nearby crews found a patch of old stain on the soil. A lab swab reported that the residue was fuel, which was consistent with the tow driver memory of gasoline smell in the truck. A chain of steps formed that linked the turnout, the audio clip, and the tow yard path. Mara was located by a social worker who knew 3 different last names for her from utility records. She met with investigators in a room that smelled like coffee, that had been reheated many times and left to think. She said she had not heard from him since that summer, and she cried in a way that was lightless but dry. When told about the drywall note, she put her head down and whispered that he tried to fix things and always left notes. She agreed to listen to the clip, then nodded and said the words were his when he felt cornered by debt and fear. She said wrong truck made sense because his brother drove a similar model and people mixed them up when angry. She said mile 12 meant the turnout where they used to watch road crews because he loved slow machines more than sleep. She asked if the word proof meant she could stop imagining him as a ghost in every passing pickup. The detective did not promise anything, which was the right call, and said the message mattered more than rumor. Mara said that was good enough for now and asked if she could visit the cabin to see the panel with her own eyes. Renata met her there with Cleo and Benito nearby, and they all stood quiet while the creek kept talking. Mara touched the pencil words like a fingertip prayer, then laughed once, small and sudden, because the handwriting was his. The county eventually sold the parcel to a quiet bidder who planned to reclaim lumber and leave the footprint for a garden. Before the sale, the sheriff office returned the panel to the property with a sealed sleeve that covered the message. A small plaque nailed to a beam recorded the date in words and the name of the deputy who first supervised repairs. It did not use the word proof, which felt right, because the wall was more than a verdict. Reporters asked Renata if she believed the drywall solved anything that mattered, and she answered with careful honesty and patience. She said it solved whether the cabin hid a message, and it offered a direction for facts to continue breathing. She said the board changed a rumor cloud into a line of checkable points that connected people who had waited years. She also said that what you call proof depends on the room you are standing in and the weight on your heart. The story kept circulating, and people kept walking that turnout and counting the faded stencils with respect and quiet. They looked for signs that someone had tried to speak in a tight corner and had chosen an odd messenger. They bent close to drywall, then stepped back and saw a small room that finally felt less like a tomb. They understood that time can hide a message, and sometimes the wall just needs a steady hand and a simple blade. When Renata thinks about the cabin now, she remembers the hush when the board came free and the pencil marks appeared. She remembers Cleo and Benito telling careful pieces and retired Deputy Kravitz recalling lemonade in a little paper cup. She remembers that proof is a rough word for a gentle thing, which is a voice asking someone to tell a person named Mara. She believes the house did what houses sometimes do, which is hold a note until the right listener finally arrives. The stories. The night guard, who logged footsteps beneath the church basement. He logged the first footsteps at 2:14, then again at 3:05, and nothing about those times made sense. The basement lights stayed off, the motion sensor blinked idle green, yet something moved under the concrete where no hallway existed. The night guard was named Alaric Boone, age 54, a retired freight dispatcher who took quiet work after his divorce. He covered the overnight shift at a weathered church on a bluff, a place with a gym, a pantry, and a low stone basement. His simple goal for that Tuesday was making rounds, checking doors, keeping the coffee hot, and finishing a crossword before sunrise. During his second loop, he heard the first set, a faint two-beat rhythm under the boiler room, steady and human. He froze by the cinder block wall, his pencil lifted, and he realized he could feel the vibration through his shoes. He marked the time in his pocket notebook, then radioed a single check-in to keep the board honest. The church sat near a small river where old mills once ran, and tunnels stitched the slope like forgotten seams. He had heard stories from lunch volunteers about a coal chute, a dumbwaiter, even a choir passage sealed long ago. None of those old features mapped exactly to the boiler room, which sat on fresh concrete poured after a flood in 2005. Alaric finished the round and told himself it was heat pipes, which seemed reasonable, though the tempo was wrong. The boiler was off to save fuel, set to wait closer to dawn, and the thermostats showed a flat night. He waited near the fuse panel and heard it again, slow steps south to north, then quiet like someone listening. He walked upstairs and checked the parking lot, which held a single sedan from a choir tenor who worked late. Across the street, the antique shop was dark, its sign unlit, the display of rotary phones a grid of dust. The guard wrote the second time down, circled it, and added a question mark he would rather have avoided. He kept a clean log because writing straight helped his nerves. A trick learned dispatching trucks through winter storms. His notebook already listed door tests, flashlight levels, and notes about the food pantry deliveries with initials and counts. Now it held two odd entries about a place that should have been solid fill and reinforced slab. On Wednesday, he set a baseline, because the simplest first step is confirming the pattern before trying explanations. He arrived 10 minutes early, brewed coffee, and walked the perimeter before the staff left and the alarms armed. He chalked a thin line along the boiler room floor, just a mark to see if any hairline crack shifted. At 2:17, he felt the same two-beat rhythm. Heel, then toe, careful, like someone stepping between puddles. It moved toward the old pantry wall, paused, then returned, and he heard a small scrape, as if brushing stone. He checked the chalk line and found nothing disturbed, which frustrated him more than if he had found scuffs. He called the on-call contact listed as Pastor Lionel Cade, age 61, a spare-voiced man who rarely slept. The pastor answered and said the church once tied into a storm culvert and the city sealed it after floods. He added that the map might be wrong, since old projects drifted from paperwork when donations moved faster than permits. The footsteps returned at 3:11, and he recorded them by holding his phone against the wall, letting the mic listen. The audio picked up a rhythmic, bassy thump and a single metal tick, like a ring hitting a pipe. He labeled the file with the date and the time and sent it to himself because he backed up everything. On Thursday, he walked the block in the afternoon and spoke with Rhea Voss, age 47, the daytime custodian. She said a volunteer once mentioned a hatch under the choir risers, then shrugged and said that was before her time. She also said a city crew excavated near the alley last winter, chasing a water pressure loss on the block. He pulled the Public Works hotline and asked for archived lines, using calm words and the steady cadence that gets patience. The operator routed him to records, where an email arrived with basic utility diagrams marked revised after 2005. The drawing placed a retired branch running 30 feet under the church, labeled Service Abandoned with a faint dotted spur. He printed the map and folded it into his pocket, then took his shift with a small knot riding his stomach. That night, the sound came earlier, 1:59, and closer to the North Foundation, which meant a path existed. He pressed his ear to the block, ignored the smell of dust and fuel oil, and heard soft breathing between steps. He decided to compare his notes against external clocks, a habit from dispatch that filtered coincidence from signal with patience. He checked transit schedules and found a freight delivery to the antique shop at midnight every other day, closed route. He marked those days with a triangle in the margin, then noticed the footsteps fell hours after the truck departed. On Friday, he asked the food pantry director, a patient woman named Mavis Alcott, age 50, whether someone used the basement. She said the pantry closed at 6 and the keys were tracked. Then she looked worried and asked if something happened. He told her he heard odd noise, nothing dangerous yet, and he would keep her informed before calling the police. He reached out to a friend who knew Boots by tread, a park ranger named Pietro Licari, age 42. Pietro listened to the phone recording and said the spacing suggested a careful adult, not a kid, likely carrying weight. He told Alaric to watch for a scrape on the off foot, a marker of someone testing boards or stones. That night, Alaric brought a cheap wildlife camera from a hardware store, just a unit that logged sound and temperature changes. He set it in the boiler room, not for video since there was nothing to see, but for time-stamped audio. He also sprinkled a narrow ribbon of flour near the expansion joint because footprints sometimes post where eyes cannot. At 2:08, the floor hummed lightly, the air felt cooler near the wall, and the camera clicked after a shift. Later, he played it back and heard a new detail, a small spray like water under pressure, then a hand tap. It sounded like someone touched a pipe and felt for vibration, which made the knot in his stomach tighten. On Saturday afternoon, he visited the public library and asked for old fire insurance maps, the kind surveyors hoarded. The librarian brought a set from 1948 and 1963, which showed a coal room under the choir. A narrow passage ran toward the river, marked as service, with a note stating shared utility with neighboring parcel. The neighboring parcel matched the antique shop, which made sense to old builders who shared trenches and split costs when money was scarce. He copied the sheet and took it to the pastor, who studied the lines, then sighed and rubbed his jaw. The pastor said a previous board closed the passage after a minor flood, then let the city handle whatever remained. Alaric asked permission to open the old choir risers to check for a hatch, and the pastor agreed to supervised access. They pulled 2 sections and found only plywood and dust, which meant the hatch was either gone or moved. Yet along the north sill, a set of nails showed different age, darker and uneven, as if boards were reused. That night, the footsteps ran later, almost 4, and quicker, like someone in a hurry who disliked being underground. He thought about calling the police, but worried he would deliver a false alarm and lose the trust he needed. Instead, he called the non-emergency line and reported suspicious subterranean noise, and the dispatcher logged it with a routine number. On Sunday morning, a congregant named Basil Ortega, age 60, told him he once saw steam venting in the alley. Basil said it happened near a rusted rectangle that looked like an access panel, then he made a helpless shrug. He also said an unfamiliar white van loaded crates behind the antique shop 2 nights earlier, long after the truck left. Alaric used his lunch to walk the alley, where he found a metal cover sunk into cracked asphalt beside an old drain. The cover was not city standard, the screws mismatched, the edges marked by recent scrapes where a bar pried. He took photos from 3 angles and emailed them to the pastor, then placed a tiny pencil mark by a bolt. He returned that night and listened, and when the footsteps began, he watched his phone clock and checked the flour. The new powder held a single faint dent by the joint, not a full print, but enough to show pressure. He leaned closer and smelled faint bleach, which meant someone cared about leaving little behind, a detail that narrowed possibilities. On Monday, he flagged the city water department and asked whether any reports showed pressure fluctuations overnight in that block. A supervisor called back and said there were brief spikes every few nights around 3, like a valve opening and closing. He added that an inspector noted a missing cap on a retired service branch near the river last winter. That call changed the tone, because pressure spikes paired with footsteps turned from mystery to infrastructure problem with risk. He told the pastor he would ask police for a walkthrough, then called the same dispatcher and requested a non-emergency assist. A patrol officer arrived with calm posture and a flashlight, listened to the audio, and agreed to a careful look. They checked the alley cover first and found the pencil mark missing, replaced by a fresh smear of dirt and oil. The officer requested a utility truck, and a crew appeared with a wrench and a portable meter that hummed softly. The crew measured sound through the cover and picked up flow. Not strong, but a whisper moving in pulses like breathing. They paused for a supervisor, who arrived with a locked case that held a camera snake used on drains and conduits. The team fed the lens past the cover and into a rough concrete passage that curved toward the church foundation. The view showed shoe scuffs on the dust, then a brass T-valve patched into an old water line with tape. The supervisor killed the street feed, then pointed at the tape and said someone had no license for that kind of work. He also said a misthreaded cap could vent gas from the adjacent service, which shifted the conversation from curiosity to hazard. The officer requested a second unit to secure the block, and they cleared the alley while keeping voices low. Inside the church, Alaric stood by the boiler room while the utility meter ticked, confirming a slight pressure bleed through the slab. The footsteps started again, softer this time, then stopped when the water cut out, which pinned the pattern with confidence. He radioed the officer, who whispered that someone was still down there, then signaled the team to quiet. A darker shape glided past the camera lens, and a hand reached to the valve, then froze when it found no resistance. The hand wore a thin mechanic glove with a tear at the knuckle, a detail that stood out like a flag. The officer announced presence through the cover, voice firm without volume, telling the person to stay still and breathe easy. A minute stretched heavy, then a voice answered, shaky and tired, saying he was stuck because the valve handle jammed. The team opened the cover and escorted out a man in his late 30s, pale, layered in dust and damp. He gave his name as Trenton Vale, age 38, the owner of the antique shop across the street with deliveries. He said he entered the old service passage months ago after a plumber showed a way to run a supplemental water line. He said he needed pressure for cleaning and steaming items, though his meter and bills did not match the usage schedule. He admitted he liked the privacy, then insisted he never touch the gas, which the utility crew would later verify. They checked his shop and found a narrow door behind a rack of film cameras that opened onto the same cracked alley. There were wet footprints on the threshold, hex-patterned soles with a little drag on the right, matching the sound spacing. There was a box of brass fittings, a saw with minimal filings, and a cardboard tray holding mismatched valve caps. At the station, according to the later report, he told them a contractor left the tool and he only learned by watching. He said the passage felt safer at night because the street was empty and he liked the quiet under the church. He also said he heard a bell once through the stone and timed his movements between scheduled campus patrols. The city documented the patched valve, sealed the retired branch, and fined the shop for unauthorized connection and trespass through utility right-of-way. The gas line near the valve showed no tampering, which eased everyone, though the near miss tightened throats along the block. The police shared a copy of the dispatch log, noting the initial call as checked and secured. Ulrich printed the log and glued it into his notebook beside the first pencil scrawl about the 2-beat rhythm. He added a short summary, stating that the footsteps tracked to an illegal water tap under the slab, then paused. He wrote that the timing aligned with utility spikes, and the alley cover thread marks confirmed regular access before the shutdown. The pastor thanked him in a staff meeting, with witnesses confirming calm handling and careful records that guided city response. Rhea patted his shoulder and said the flower idea was odd and smart, then promised to mop where he dusted. Mavis delivered coffee and said the pantry would have closed for days if the water had been fouled by sediment. Pietro called and laughed softly, saying the drag heard in the recording matched the right boot scuff found at the door. He said the pattern on the sole looked like an old surplus boot, hex blocks that turned slick on damp concrete. He liked that a simple tape recorder pinned a path better than a dozen guesses and said, "Well done." Weeks later, the utility crew returned and filled the passage with flowable mix, a gray slurry that hardens without voids. They left a small marker in the alley for the map, a stamped square showing the retired line and closure date. Inside the boiler room, the floor stayed quiet. The green light blinked the same, and the chalk line gathered dust. People asked Alaric if he was scared while listening to footsteps underneath, and he always answered with a half smile. He said fear is different from alert, and alert is what he used when tracking trucks through black ice before sunrise. He also said the quiet afterward felt heavier than the noise because silence makes you question whether you imagined everything. He kept the notebook in his locker and reread the first pages when he doubted why small details matter during routine nights. The triangle marks still sat by the delivery days, and the circles still highlighted the times that repeated like a clock. He had added a final entry stating that listening is a skill and that meters and maps are companions. Trenton kept the shop open under a suspended operations agreement, limited hours, supervised water, and a written promise about deliveries. He came by once with a receipt and asked the pastor to sign a community service form for repair work around the lot. He paused near the boiler room door and stared at the concrete, then thanked Alaric without meeting his eyes. Alaric nodded and said, "Take care," then wrote a line later that night about how people choose their own pressure. He meant water and he meant life, and the line read corny on the page, so he crossed a word and moved on. He folded the notebook closed, poured fresh coffee, and walked the church perimeter while the river hummed under the bluff. He still listened in places others ignored because careful listening had made a map where drawings ended and footsteps began. He carried the printed utility sketch until the paper softened, then kept the new revised copy with the closure stamp. He filed both in a manila folder labeled basement under the church, just a marker in case memory failed years later. In his mind, the story stayed simple. A man heard footsteps where no hallway should run and wrote the times carefully. The notes pressed outward into witnesses, maps, meters, and one rusted cover that told the truth when a bolt turned. The payoff was not drama, but a good fix, which is better, and the quiet afterward made sense again. The stories. Paramedic who returned a ring to the ranger station. He found the ring beneath a bench outside the ranger station after a thunderstorm cleared and left everything smelling like pennies. The inscription was shallow from wear, yet legible enough to stop him cold before he tossed it in Lost and Found. His name was Daryl Keene, 32, paramedic on the rural night unit that parked near the station between calls. He had clocked out late and planned to drive home for eggs and sleep, nothing heavier than traffic and weather. The ring was small, silver, scuffed, with 4 letters etched inside that did not match any brand he recognized. He wiped it on his shirt, felt ridiculous superstition prickle his neck, then reminded himself that metal was just metal. He walked into the station lobby where the maps curled at the edges and flyers begged hikers to sign trail registers. The clerk on duty that morning was a seasonal hire named Isabel Rusk, 26, wildlife biology graduate and coffee loyalist. She wrote the ring in the inventory ledger, asked his phone number for a courtesy call, and slid it into a tray. Dario left a note by instinct, a paramedic habit, logging time and location and weather in case someone asked later. Out in the parking lot, he replayed last night, which featured a stranded camper with mild hypothermia and a false alarm. He could not shake the ring, which was strange, because he usually forgot objects once they were filed and numbered. On his day off, he cut through town for groceries and noticed a poster at the laundromat that mentioned a missing ring. The page was sun-warped and stapled crooked, with a photocopied hand and the same 4 letters circled in black pen. The contact tear slip was gone, but a name remained that matched an old Ranger call sign he knew from dispatch. He remembered hearing it during training, tucked into an anecdote about a search several winters before he joined the unit. Back at his apartment, he opened a plastic tote where he kept spiral notebooks filled with patient notes and road observations. He used them to steady his head when night shifts stacked up and details blurred into one long siren-haunted ribbon. He flipped through a winter notebook and found an entry about a storm closure at the North Ridge trailhead near mile marker. There was a scribble about a reported vehicle in the lot after midnight and a reference to archived calls marked cold case. The 4 letters matched the poster and the notebook, and his stomach tightened like he had stepped into empty air unexpectedly. He told himself it was coincidence. Then he looked again at the handwriting and knew he would not sleep without checking. He drove to the station and asked for Isabel, who had just come off trail crew support and smelled faintly like pine cleaner. She retrieved the tray, confirmed the ledger entry, and admitted that the ring already drew a call from a withheld number. The caller reportedly asked whether the inscription was intact, then hung up when she offered the standard lost property procedure. Isabel shrugged and said weird things find the station every year, then asked why he looked like he had swallowed a tack. Dario explained the poster and his notes, careful with phrasing, avoiding names and exact dates that might tag private people. He asked whether the old Ranger call sign meant anything to her, and she frowned like a person trying to remember a ringtone. She typed on a terminal that still beeped like an old cash register and pulled up a thin incident summary from past seasons. The report mentioned a volunteer ranger named Lyle Witt, mid-40s, seen last signing out to check a flooded culvert. Witness statements suggested he turned off the main road to assist a motorist in a heavy rain that erased tire tracks. Final footage from a highway maintenance camera showed headlights near the ridge turnout, then heavy static as wind battered the lens. The four letters in the ring inscription matched his initials and a nickname the volunteer used on old trail day signboards. The summary ended with a note that the vehicle and the volunteer were not recovered despite grid searches and river scans. Daryl felt the room narrow, which happened to him on difficult scenes when he needed to pick the next useful action. He asked whether they ever collected personal property from that area, and Isabel said most recovered items turned up much later. She added that spring melt exposes things that winter hides, and lost metal often travels far in culverts and channels. Daryl asked to sign a witness statement, which felt strange, since his only act had been bending for a glint under a bench. He described the find with plain details, like distance from the threshold and position of the bench slats and water stains. He included the weather and the timestamp from his phone, then he photographed the ledger page with permission for his records. On his way out, he noticed a corkboard with dryer lint textures of flyers, including one about historic flood years and culvert maintenance. A little printed square described a storm nearly 20 years back that undercut the ridge road and formed a temporary sinkhole. The line about road repairs matched a rumor he had heard on overnight radio, the sort of thing callers debate between traffic updates. He took a photo of the square and wrote down the maintenance contact number, then drove home feeling like the ground rode along. That evening, he called the maintenance office and reached a supervisor named Raleigh Dim, 51, veteran of patchwork and paperwork. Raleigh remembered the volunteer by call sign and said the guy reportedly once welded a broken gate hinge on his lunch hour. He explained that the ridge turnout drained into a service culvert that emptied into an old arroyo behind a shuttered campground. He added that a private tow company once pulled an abandoned sedan from a side basin during late summer, then misplaced the paperwork. Daryl asked whether the county kept disposal receipts, and Raleigh said archived bills lived in a warehouse that smelled like motor oil. He offered to meet the next morning with access to the paper stacks if Daryl did not mind dust and swearing at faded ink. They met in a low building whose metal roof pinged when gulls landed, and Raleigh rolled out a ladder and a cart with binders. Daryl paged through invoices and found a line item for a recovered vehicle from the ridge vicinity after a storm year. The receipt lacked a plate number, which set his teeth on edge, but it listed a description that matched the volunteer's truck. A handwritten note in the margin directed the tow company to hold personal effects for a claim that never arrived or cleared. Daryl used his phone to scan the page, then asked Raleigh whether the side basin ever got dredged for heavy debris after storms. Raleigh nodded and said they tried, but the basin had pockets where things settled deep and stayed quiet until a new season. Back at the station, Isabel took the scanned receipt and added it to a folder that had begun to resemble a small case file. She called the number from the old poster just in case, and it rang to a voicemail that no longer accepted messages. They agreed not to speculate out loud, which is how responsible people hold a line between curiosity and harm to private families. Instead, they requested access to dispatch logs from that storm week, using internal email channels and precise language about inventory continuity. The logs showed multiple calls reporting a stalled vehicle and disappearing taillights near the ridge turnout around the same time. One archived call captured a voice asking if the station had a spare chain, then cutting out as thunder rolled over everything. Daryl listened and felt a human scale of time, the way a minute expands when weather takes over and simple plans collapse. He thought about why the ring would end up under the bench unless someone placed it, then pictured stormwater spreading like a net. Isabel checked the station exterior and found a grill over a drain that emptied near the bench after long downhill runs. She traced the channel on the maintenance map and saw a path from the arroyo through a culvert that cut beneath the parking lot. It sounded improbable at first, then they considered how small objects ride water differently than larger debris during heavy flow. A ring could slip past grates like a coin tossed to luck, then settle where turbulence died and janitors swept after hours. They walked the route during daylight and marked scuff lines from past flows, following pebbles like breadcrumbs to the station edge. At a low grate, they found a snag of twigs and a strip of cloth that might be from a work shirt pocket. Isabel bagged the cloth and labeled it for possible testing, though neither expected much, and both respected quiet possibilities. They logged locations and took photos from eye level and boot level, then stored everything in the folder that felt heavier daily. That night, a withheld number called the station again and left a message that asked whether the initials were still visible. The voice sounded older and careful, and the caller reportedly asked about stainless versus silver, then thanked someone who had not answered. Daryl suspected a relative who wanted privacy, so he did not push for a callback through caller lookup that might bruise boundaries. Instead, he asked Isabel to post a simple notice that an item was found, with identification proof required and no description. 3 days later, a woman arrived with wind-bitten cheeks and an envelope of photocopies of Trail Day signboards and old photos. She introduced herself as Marnie Witt, 50, postal clerk, and said she believed the ring belonged to someone she once knew. She produced a photocopy of a volunteer roster with initial marks that matched the inscription style and the spacing between letters. She also brought a scanned image of a birthday photo reportedly taken at the station picnic where the ring first appeared on a hand. Isabel followed procedure, asked neutral questions, and requested a description without revealing any difference between steel and silver. Marnie said it was silver and scuffed from manual work, and the letters were done with a cheap engraving pen from a hardware counter. She had no interest in press or drama, only closure regarding a box of things that never found a rightful shelf at home. She did not ask about remains or rumors, and the room felt like a church hallway, with voices quietly minding the floor echo. Daryl watched her study the ring like a person watching weather, accepting change without bargaining. Then she nodded and held it close. She signed the claim form and thanked them for record keeping, then said she planned to take the ring to a quiet spot and breathe. After she left, Daryl and Isabel sat silently with a folder that could be closed even without answers that win headlines. They updated the file with non-identifying language, noting that the event remained unresolved, but an item found its probable keeper. A week later, Raleigh called to say the warehouse yielded another stack of toe slips that linked the earlier receipt to a dated work order. The order referenced a truck pulled from a side basin near the arroyo, with no occupant listed and disposal recorded after waiting periods. Daryl printed the work order and attached it to the file, then suggested a courtesy memo to the county records office for alignment. The memo included excerpts from dispatch logs, witness statements, and the inventory ledger, written plainly, without speculation or sharp claims. He drove to the turnout that evening and parked where the wind rolled downhill like a waterless river over dry grass. He stood by the newly repaired grate and imagined a ring skipping through stormwater, then settling under a bench as the world dried. On the way back, he stopped at the laundromat and saw the old poster had been removed, the staple holes still marking the cork. He felt relief, and something else that did not have a tidy name, a feeling like finishing a call without losing anyone. At the station, Isabel had taped a small note above the lost and found that read, "Inventory matters, please describe details patiently." Daryl smiled because he knew how patience saved lives on ugly roads, and how tiny facts often carried heavy conclusions silently. He wrote a final entry in his notebook that summarized the chain of events, using timestamps and neutral phrasing like a field report. He listed his own doubts and how they changed, which he did after tough nights, so future him remembered the shape of useful doubt. He drove home and fried eggs and left the radio off, letting the quiet fill in around the edges of the long day. In the morning, he returned to duty and checked his ambulance kit twice, then a third time, because routine confidence keeps hands steady. News never broke big from the ridge, and that felt right. Because families deserve weathered truths without strangers guessing for sport. The station kept the folder in a locked cabinet with a slip that directed any future inquiry to records with gentle formality. When Daryl parked near the bench again, he looked at the drain and thanked the design that nudged a small thing into daylight. He also thanked the habit of writing things down, because memory can bend when nights are long and calls stack like restless waves. He knew the ring did not fix the story, yet it tightened the edges enough to hold, like stitching on a torn sleeve. He decided that returning it mattered regardless of headlines, because care can look like a metal circle resting in a palm. Later, a storm rolled across the hills and the station roof hammered, but the grate held and the lot drained without drama. Daryl watched the water pass the bench and felt steadier than the week before, which is a kind of quiet rescue in itself. He thought about that last highway camera clip that cut out as wind rose, and he hoped the driver knew someone kept looking. He believed that simple custody of small objects carried weight, and he promised himself to keep taking notes when the world blurred. The next week, a handwritten thank you arrived with no return address, just a single sentence about holding grief like a stone. Isabel logged the letter, then placed it in the file where it settled beside receipts and call logs and dry photographs. They closed the cabinet gently, like leaving a campsite clean, and the station returned to business with maps and radios humming. Daryl stepped outside, breathed air that smelled like wet bark, and felt awake enough to meet the next ordinary emergency. He walked past the bench and saw nothing shine, and that unremarkable view felt right, like a road that finally held its line. The vanishing trail crew of Glacier Bay. In early summer of 2019, a three-person trail crew sailed from Bartlett Cove toward a maintenance site beyond Tidal Inlet. Their assignment sounded routine, though the weather showed unsettled fronts rolling off icy strait with choppy swell and low gray ceilings. According to dispatch logs kept at Gustavus, the supervisor signed out a skiff, a radio, and a laminated route sheet. By evening, the radio stayed quiet, and the cove slip remained open where their skiff usually tied after day runs. Park staff noted the silence, then logged a late return without escalation, since crews sometimes bivouacked on gravel bars when fog thickened. The crew leader was Mark Hilliard, 42, a backcountry ranger tasked with coordinating seasonal trail work near the outer bays. He reportedly knew the coves and embayments from years of kayak patrols and small engine repair during rough spring openings. The second was Dana Ruiz, 29, a seasonal laborer hired from Juneau who handled saw work and minor bridge decking. The third was Chris Lawton, 34, a contractor from Sitka brought in to evaluate 3 washed-out footlogs after late snowmelt. Their stated purpose, according to state records, was clearing windfall and flagging a reroute above a recurring slide near Geikie Inlet. Before they left, archived notes mentioned barometer readings that fell through midday while the outer channels carried a long northwest swell. The skiff carried fuel for 2 days, spare plugs, and a small tarp shelter along with first aid and food. Radios were checked on channel 16, then switched to a park channel listed on the route sheet, which later drew attention. A maintenance tech recalled a faint transmission near mid-afternoon that cut off mid-word, which investigators never confirmed due to static. That fragment became the last possible voice contact tied to the listed call signs for the team. A search began the next morning after the boathouse recorded another empty slip and a duplicate late return entry. 2 rangers motored north with binoculars, while another ranger canvassed the shoreline pullouts toward Latuya side creeks. Some locals claimed the fog held so low that boats could not safely round a point past Blue Mouse, yet the forecast suggested clearing. Records conflict on whether a small craft advisory persisted inside the bay, since buoy readings at the entrance were intermittent. That uncertainty complicated estimates about how far a light skiff could reasonably travel before fuel became a constraint. Investigators mapped likely routes using the laminated sheet, which showed intended stops at 2 trailheads reachable at higher tides. The tides reportedly ran moderate, with an afternoon flood that might have pulled drift along shoals beside rocky shelves. The team expected to camp if work ran past daylight, and their kit included a compact stove and reflective line for food hangs. When crews bivouac, standard practice is a radio check by nightfall, which the supervisor marked as missed without immediate alarm. That detail later drew criticism from an internal review about staggered check times during early season operations. By day 3, aviation assets from Juneau conducted low passes along beaches where fresh bear tracks crisscrossed stranded kelp. They found no shelter remains, no new fire rings, and no visible sawdust piles around down spruce trunks. A canvas tool roll surfaced near a cut bank east of Reed Inlet, where cedar shims rattled inside when shaken. The roll matched a brand issued to contractors, though serial numbers had worn smooth after seasons of wet handling. Photographs entered into a county file from 2009 showed similar rolls, which helped at least narrow provenance despite missing initials. Divers searched a narrow cove where eddies collect logs and fuel cans during strong flood cycles. Visibility was poor, and the kelp line braided around jagged rock, though one diver very carefully traced anchor rope scars. A fragment of polypropylene line surfaced with frayed ends, which one report suggested looked cut by abrasion rather than a blade. That interpretation remained tentative, and investigators never confirmed a definitive source, given the number of skiffs working the bay that month. The fragment went into evidence with salt still weeping from its fibers under the station heater. An engine mechanic reviewed maintenance logs and found the assigned outboard had a recent impeller change and a clean carburetor bowl. Fuel samples from the boathouse tank tested normal, matching dye standards from vendor shipments logged in late May. A spare pull cord remained coiled in the skiff locker, which mattered only if the original cord failed during a stall. Some locals claimed a finicky kill switch on older housings sometimes tripped when gear snagged lanyards, though the assigned model used a firm clip. The review marked that risk as low, while the absence of the skiff kept all mechanical theories hypothetical. Witness interviews in Gustavus produced two partial sightings near mid-afternoon on the departure day. A charter captain remembered a small skiff crossing his wake beyond rushing tide chop, with three figures huddled tight behind the console. A wildlife photographer reported seeing a tarp flash near a gravel bar as fog pressed in, which could have been a shelter or a sail. Investigators never confirmed either sighting, and times in both statements drifted by nearly an hour when compared against GPS tracks. The gap left a narrow window where the team could have diverted toward a lower beach to ride out visibility. Searchers found a tied bundle of flagging tape and a small notebook wedged inside drift farther north than planners expected. The notebook pages were swollen, and only 2 lines remained legible under a gentle light passed across the pulp. One line mentioned reroute stakes on a slope where runoff undercut black soil above exposed roots. The second line listed an intended return by last light, conditional on fog break, which tracked with the route sheet initialed by the supervisor. Rainwater had blurred the date, though the hand looked like Hilliard's based on earlier training rosters. A separate thread emerged when a weather station east of the bay logged a brief wind reversal just after local dusk. Analysts suggested a squall line briefly bent around coastal contours, which can push light craft toward shoals that sit quieter under normal flow. That pattern reportedly funnels drift into coves that lack safe holding ground, and engines sometimes cavitate when kelp tangles the intake. If the crew anchored close to shore for shelter, the reversal might have swung the skiff into rocks that cut the line. No direct evidence confirmed this sequence, yet the modeling aligned with prior minor incidents recorded in archived notes. The investigative summary leaned on timelines built from radio silence, soft sightings, and flotsam that could travel widely between tides. A ranger from Hoona urged a broader sweep toward channels where currents sneak around into unlikely pockets after long flood cycles. Teams walked beaches between Gustavus Flats and remote coves, talking with anglers who watched the weather stall without fully clearing. Some anglers remembered a light, late roar that sounded like wind against fur, which the report treated as ambiguous noise. The absence of consistent debris made every hypothesis feel more like a chart line than a settled route. State records document that family members arrived within a week, sat with maps, and asked for any proof beyond soggy paper. The park arranged rooms and daily briefings where night shift returns were read aloud with steady voices and careful phrasing. One meeting paused when a radio squealed on a distant desk, which briefly raised heads before the tone settled to a routine call. A liaison reportedly described how glacial bays keep and release things on schedules that ignore search grids and human clocks. That line echoed through notes, though the summary avoided metaphor and kept to distances, bearings, and tide spans. A second pass, months later, uncovered a hard hat trapped under root wad tangles near a creek mouth south of Geikie. The hat band had two initials that matched Dana, though tape adhesive lifted when dried, which limited certainty. Tool marks along the rim looked ordinary, the kind made by brush and rock during fast water drops after rain. Investigators never confirmed whether the hat drifted from the original work zone or from unrelated transport on a different week. Records conflict about when the creek last flooded high enough to carry light gear out across the inner bay. The final report avoided a single cause, and the language reads like a ledger that refuses to overstate unknowns. It lists weather instability, marginal visibility, and complex tides in a coast cut by steep walls that focus wind without warning. It notes an apparent failure of scheduled radio checks during a 2-hour window that stretched before active search began. It names the crew, their roles, their route, and the known objects found without embellishment or dramatic framing. It closes by acknowledging that no remains were recovered, while urging periodic shoreline checks during future maintenance flights. A maintenance season reopened the next year with new check-in rules and duplicated radio prompts at midday and last light. Crews now carry waterproof slates for brief status notes, and route sheets include alternate coves where ground holds are safer. Supervisors added a second lanyard check on kill switches after hearing recurring stories about unexpected clips popping during rough rides. Those changes live in training binders that reference this case by number and not by narrative, which the staff understands. The binder index points to a county file from 2009 that happens to store similar coastal incident templates. People around Gustavus still mention the team when weather drops low and the channel flattens, with strange quiet at slack. A marina clerk remembers Dana weighing spare chain on a handheld scale, making sure the anchor would bite into mixed gravel. A mechanic recalls Chris laughing about a stubborn plug while methodically reseating the wire to satisfy his own standards. Some locals claimed they saw 3 distant figures on a bar that night, though distance turns sure shapes into moving smudges. The record keeps the account open while the bay holds its own patterns, and the trail waits under wet green. The stories. Paramedic returned a ring to this hospital wing. The ring sat in a small evidence pouch with a folded intake label, and the label named "This Hospital Wing." Security logged the delivery in the overnight book with a careful time, and they filmed the handoff at the ambulance bay. Calder Ruiz was 34, and he worked nights on a private ambulance that covered the mixed urban fringe. He drove a high-mileage rig with a sticky rear latch, and he kept a quiet notebook under the dash. He finished paperwork after sunrise when the cafeteria coffee tasted burnt and the elevators finally ran without packed gurneys. His simple plan for this morning made sense, and it fit the tired mood of the shift. He would drop the ring, sign the property line, and clock out before the traffic built. The ring was a plain yellow band with a shallow engraving, and the engraving read LK and May 14. He did not remember any patient who mentioned jewelry, and their overnight calls were ordinary transfers and one shortness of breath. The band came from under the bench cushion during cleanup, and he spotted it when a pen rolled and tapped. He pocketed the pouch because it felt wrong to leave it, and he headed for the East Wing desk. The East Wing used to hold telemetry and a step-down, and now it served as a rehab overflow when beds ran tight. The desk kept a property log from older times, and the same binder continued through years of tape and patchwork pages. The unit clerk looked at the label and frowned, and she called for the charge nurse by habit. The charge nurse checked the overnight admits and shook her head, and she said nothing matched a ring for this wing. She asked which patient lost it, and he told her none of their patients mentioned a ring at all. She said they could place it in central security, and they would open a claim if anyone asked later. He nodded but felt a tug, and the label still named this wing in plain handwriting. He asked if the desk ever handled stray property like that, and the charge nurse said it occasionally happened. A maintenance tech leaned from a ladder and listened, and he said the East Wing had its own ghosts by reputation. He laughed when the nurse shot a look, and he added that he meant the cardboard kind. He explained that old property envelopes sometimes turned up behind cabinets, and housekeeping would move them along. He said linens and small items traveled strange paths when movers closed floors, and people forgot until someone asked later. Calder thanked him, then he asked permission to check the binder for older notations. The clerk slid it over and pointed to a rule that said deliveries needed 2 staff signatures. The binder held thick pages with names and room numbers, and some entries noted patient transfers to other wings. Calder skimmed recent weeks and then months, and nothing showed the initials LK, or any ring notes. He asked if the wing ever logged items that did not belong to current patients, and the clerk said rarely. She remembered a wedding band that fell through a bed frame on a weekend, and it took months to track. She said a therapist found it during a lift motor replacement, and the family cried when they got the call. The clerk shrugged and said the hospital felt like a moving chest of drawers, and odds and ends migrated forever. Calder walked to security with the pouch, and the guard on duty scanned the label with a handheld. The guard said the pouch style looked older, and the zip strip color was not used anymore. The guard printed the receipt and asked for a description, and Calder gave the engraving as clearly as possible. The guard searched a property database and found no ring tickets for the wing, and his search covered 2 years by default. Calder asked if there were archived losses in older years, and the guard said records before 2014 were scanned PDFs. The guard called upstairs and requested access to a shared drive, and the wait felt like a small eternity. Calder stood under the camera bubble and reviewed his shift notes, and the notes listed 4 dispatch times with addresses redacted here. He wrote a short line about a transfer from a rehab floor with a pleasant dog calendar, and he wrote another about a night custodian who kept a radio. None of the lines mentioned a ring, and none of the patients wore jewelry in obvious ways. He opened his phone gallery and checked the bench photo he took for restocking, and the timestamp matched their return to the bay. The ring did not appear in that picture, and the bench looked clean and dull. He wondered if the ring slid loose after the photo when the rig shuddered, and the thought did not settle his nerves. The guard waved him back and offered a chair, and they opened a folder of ripped black and white scans. One report flagged an incident in the East Wing, and the date read May 14 of 2010. The note said a patient property bag failed during a bed change, and a ring listed as L.K. went missing. The report said staff searched the room, and linen hampers were checked in central processing. A second note added that the family could not be reached, and a voicemail box stayed full for weeks. The case closed without resolution, and the scan ended with a faded stamp that looked handmade. Calder felt the small click that happens when separate lines meet, and the label suddenly seemed heavier than its weight. He asked if the room number was legible, and the guard zoomed until the pixels turned into blocks. The number looked like 212 or 217, and the wing layout had changed since then. The guard said maintenance might have an old map, and a shop supervisor kept binders in a cage downstairs. Calder thanked him, and he asked to make a quick copy of the scan for his crew file. The guard printed the page and stamped a copy line, and he urged Calder to keep things simple with the wing. On the loading dock, a housekeeper pushed a rolling cart, and she mentioned hearing about a ring on the radio. She said her aunt worked here years ago as a transporter, and her aunt remembered a family who asked about LK. The aunt thought LK stood for Lena Kovacs, and that name showed up on a donor plaque somewhere. The housekeeper stressed that it was just a memory, and people mixed up stories after long shifts. Calder thanked her and asked which plaque she meant, and she guessed it could be by the therapy gym. He made a note with a star, and he promised nothing beyond a respectful check. Maintenance loaned him a binder with a taped spine, and the old East Wing diagram showed rooms from 190 to 230. A paper tab marked a wall removal year in 2005, and the spaces had been reconfigured since that renovation. The diagram showed linen chutes and mechanical closets, and one chute lined up behind the current rehab gym. Calder compared the faded room to a modern corner, and the old room 212 would be near the therapy office. He felt the workable line appear, and it had more gears than luck. He thanked the supervisor and returned the binder, and he set off toward the gym. The therapy office had a bulletin board with service pins, and a small photo showed a woman in scrubs named Kovacs. A caption said she ran a staff fundraiser in 2011, and the photo looked like a copy of a copy. Calder asked the receptionist if Miss Kovacs still worked there, and the receptionist said she retired years ago. The receptionist checked a directory and found no current contact, and then she opened a drawer with old alumni notes. She found a folded program from a memorial tea, and the newsletter said, "Lena Kovacs lost a husband early." The print used careful language, and it did not mention the ring or the initials. Calder felt a chill that did not belong to superstition, and he asked security if he could call the number on the old scan. The guard said the number probably died years ago, and he recommended the hospital volunteer office for family links. Calder went there and explained the situation, and he kept details minimal and careful. The volunteer coordinator listened and nodded, and then she showed him a book of donor inscriptions. She pointed at a plaque near the rehab gym, and the name said, "Kovacs Family Therapy Garden," with a small leaf icon. She said the family sometimes visited during late summer, and she could pass a message through a general email. Calder returned to the East Wing desk and asked again to log the ring, and he added the old report number on the form. The charge nurse read his notes and raised an eyebrow, and she asked whether this was a lost patient or a lost object. Calder answered it was certainly an object, and he was trying to avoid making anyone hurt again. She stared at the band through the plastic and then nodded, and she initialed the line for custody. She called linen services and requested a search of older chutes, and she asked maintenance about a recent vibration test nearby. She then told Calder she appreciated the thoroughness, and she would add her number to the receipt. On his lunch break that arrived at almost noon, Calder called his partner from the shift and asked about the bench cushion. His partner said the cushion ripped months ago near the latch, and small things sometimes fell into that hollow void. He said he once lost a pen that rolled out 3 weeks later, and they both laughed about the gremlins. Calder asked if any hospital staff had borrowed their transport stretcher recently, and his partner said rehab used it during a power test yesterday. The partner said the rehab techs pushed the stretcher over a threshold that made the whole thing shudder. Calder pictured the ring jumping free inside the cushion, and the moment drew a simple line through time. He walked to biomedical engineering and asked about the rehab stretcher loan, and the tech on duty pulled an asset report. The report showed a loan to the East Wing therapy office, and the return time matched their arrival last night. The tech said the stretcher had a known rattle in the side rail, and small items could migrate if they slipped. Calder requested permission to inspect the rail, and the tech handed over a hex key with a cautious smile. He removed the end cap and tipped the rail, and a dust mix fell with a soft hiss. Nothing else emerged, and the ring hypothesis remained just that. And yet, it still felt reasonable. Calder tried laundry services next and asked whether a ring could travel from a chute to a truck and back. The supervisor said it happened rarely, and a ring could ride a torn bag to a cart and escape later. The supervisor said older chutes sometimes released surprises when motors kicked, and vibration made lost things walk. She said one time a pager chimed from a folded blanket, and everyone jumped because the model was ancient. She wrote down the ring details and promised to ask her staff, and she asked for the property receipt number. Calder thanked her and climbed the stairs because the elevator seemed suddenly crowded. A retired nurse named Myra arrived for a flu shot, and she recognized the old pouch design at the east desk. She said those pouches vanished after 2012, and she used to seal them with a blue strip. She looked at the initials and stopped, and she softly said Lena kept her maiden name for work. She remembered a shift when a patient requested a chaplain, and afterward a ring went missing from the bag. She said they turned the room upside down and found nothing, and she cried telling the family that week. She asked whether the ring was truly here now, and the charge nurse said it was in security as of this morning. Calder asked whether Myra could share a statement, and she agreed to write a short note with dates as best she could. Her handwriting looked steady for a long history, and she described a bed change and a linen swap. She recalled a code earlier that day in a nearby room, and equipment had moved through the hallway quickly. She said carts piled up while everyone managed the chaos, and the chute doors swung as orderlies cleared hampers. She noted that Lena worked that corridor and often stayed late, and she kept paperwork near the therapy office. Myra ended by saying the family did not push a complaint, and the grief felt huge enough already. Calder added the note to the property file, and he asked security to copy the PDF and the asset report. The guards stapled everything carefully and wrote a short chain of custody line, and then he called his supervisor. The supervisor arrived and listened without interruption, and he nodded at each small connective piece. He said it sounded plausible that the ring traveled by linen or by stretcher rail, and the return timing fit. He asked whether anyone had reached the Kovacs family, and the volunteer office answered that a general email was sent. He decided the ring should be placed with the wing director for now, and then returned when the family responded. Calder walked the ring to the wing director with the charge nurse, and the director unlocked a small safe by the desk. The director read the file twice and looked out at the therapy gym, and he seemed to count years without words. He thanked Calder for not turning this into a story beyond the facts, and he said the path felt honest. He said sometimes the building kept tiny traps from old renovations, and objects slid back into daylight when ready. He placed the ring pouch on a velvet pad, and he wrote the time and his name with a careful hand. He said they would hold the ring in the wing, and they would make sure the right people heard. That afternoon, a volunteer returned with a printed email, and the message contained a phone number that still worked. The director asked Calder to stay as a witness, and they called the number on speaker in a quiet office. A woman answered and identified herself as Mira, and she said she was Lena's niece by marriage. She listened to the summary and asked a few precise questions, and her voice shook on the second. She said her aunt still wore a thin band and a chain, and this sounded like her husband's original ring. She said the family visited the garden plaque every May, and they never stopped asking about a lost ring. They met in a neutral conference room with frosted glass, and the director set the pouch on the table. Mira brought a small photo from 2010, and the ring in the picture looked like the one in the pouch. She asked to hold it for a moment, and then she breathed as if she had been underwater too long. She pointed to a tiny scratch on the inner edge, and it matched a bike fall from their early years together. She explained that the initials were his and hers, and the date marked the wedding by a justice in a quiet office. She thanked the room and said she did not want a ceremony, and she was just grateful for care. Calder signed the witness line and pushed the pen toward the director, and the moment felt weightless and plain. Mira asked whether anyone would mind if she visited the therapy garden, and the director offered to walk her there. She asked if the ring could remain with the wing for a little while, and she wanted to place flowers first. The director said the wing would be honored, and he promised to contact her if any details surfaced later. Calder stood back and watched the distance between grief and closure collapse, and it looked like a hallway finally cleared. He nodded to the charge nurse and pocketed his notebook, and he promised to replace the bench cushions soon. 2 days later, the linen supervisor called Calder and said a tech found a torn seam in the stretcher cover. The tear ran along a hidden edge that opened under vibration, and small things could hide there without notice. The tech also found a coin lodged deep inside, and its date hit the same era noted in the file. The supervisor said this was not proof of the ring path, and it felt like a friendly witness. Calder took a picture of the seam and added it to the binder, and he logged the maintenance request for replacement. The small chain of custody now included the rail and the cover, and the line grew stronger without pretending certainty. The wing director arranged a short gathering by the therapy garden, and a few staff who remembered Lena came by. They set a small card that said, "Returned to the East Wing," and they left space for a family decision. Mira arrived with her 2 cousins and a bouquet, and she asked if she could speak to the gathered staff. She thanked everyone for treating the story with hands open, and she said the ring could stay displayed for 1 week. After that week, she would take it home, and she would bring it back every May as a quiet practice. People nodded because the balance felt right, and the garden bench caught the late light gently. Calder watched from the edge with his coffee, and he remembered the pen that tapped the bench before he saw the ring. He thought about the way buildings hold on to things, and how people read meaning into dust and echo. He thought about dispatch logs that look cold until someone traces them, and then the script becomes a real day. He considered the lines that join strangers into an honest arc, and he respected each break where evidence speaks. The ring did not prove fate, and it did prove persistence, and it showed that care can be methodical. He left the garden before the applause faded, and he headed for the bay to start another shift. On his next overnight run, he noticed the new bench cushion, and it no longer swallowed dropped pens into hiding. He kept his notebook on the dash and wrote a line about the East Wing, and he kept the words simple. He wrote that a ring once traveled the hospital like a seed on wind, and the wind finally stopped here. He wrote that people made that stop happen by checking maps and calling quietly, and by not rushing a story. He wrote that the wing felt different now, and the difference came from patience more than any grand event. He closed the book and turned on the radio, and the night answered with the ordinary sound of work. Weeks later, the director sent a copy of a small framed note, and it now sat by the garden plaque. The note stated that a staff family recovered a long missing ring, and it had rested here for a time. It stated that the return involved a paramedic, a clerk, a guard, a supervisor, and a retired nurse. It added that the file included a torn stretcher cover and a scan dated May 14 of 2010. It invited no legend and made no claim beyond the chain of quotes and receipts, and it felt right that way. Calder clipped the note into a shift binder and smiled, and then he got called out for a routine transfer. On the way past the east wing doors, he slowed and looked in, and the desk lamp made the binder glow. The charge nurse raised a hand without words, and the unit seemed calm in the bright noon. He thought again about how evidence moves on small wheels and how the best stories stay quiet when finished. He considered how many families carry unclosed lines and how sometimes a lost object can stitch one shut. He knew this ring did not solve grief, and it gave shape to a memory that had gone thin with years. He swung the rig into the daylight and felt the road through the wheel, and the city rolled forward like usual. Months later, he learned that Mira returned each May with flowers, and she touched the glass with the ring inside. The volunteer office kept the file updated in a narrow drawer, and the drawer label read East Wing Recoveries. Security replaced the camera bubble over the bay and kept the old unit for parts, and they joked about relics. The maintenance supervisor finally tossed the torn cover after documenting it, and he felt oddly proud of the careful record. The hospital moved through another winter without big headlines, and the garden kept the same soft wind under the windows. Calder kept working nights and never chased mention, and the crew understood without any speech at all. He still told new hires one short version during checkout, and he kept the details clear of romance. He said a ring with initials LK turned up under a bench after a stretcher loan, and the label named this wing. He said the date on the old report matched the engraving, and the linen path explained the long delay. He said good records and patient calls made the circle close, and that promise is why they log everything. He said someone cried without making a scene, and that is how truth usually presents itself at work. Then he pointed to the property pouch drawer and the fresh bench cushion, and he told them to check twice. Calder visited the garden once more after a busy night, and he stood alone before the building woke completely. He watched sun slide across the plaque letters until the leaf icon warmed, and the quiet felt unearned and good. He thought of how small choices build bridges that do not announce themselves, and then one step reveals the span. He remembered a retired nurse who wrote a careful line and a housekeeper who shared a family guess. He remembered a guard who kept files neat and a director who knew not to fill silence. He placed his palm on the cool railing and chose no grand meaning, and he simply wished everyone a gentle day. The ring returned to this hospital wing by documented steps, and the steps were ordinary and human and steady. The story did not need a mystery beyond time and movement, and it showed how rooms keep modest promises. He considered that a bench cushion, a torn cover, and a faded scan can hold a family together again. He thought that is enough for any place built to heal, and he walked back to the bay without speaking. He started the rig and checked the lights, and the reflections blinked across the wet asphalt. He breathed, then he rolled toward the morning traffic, and the work met him with the same quiet weight.